It's no secret that American politics has featured a sharp partisan divide. Our next guest has actually written a book with the title The Fractured Republic, yet he also sees what he identifies as a search for solidarity. That was a key message in his recent John W. Pope lecture at North Carolina State University. Yuval Levin is editor of National Affairs. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we mentioned at the outset, no one could be surprised if we're going to talk about a partisan divide.
Right.
But you did focus on this notion that despite the divide, that there is a search for solidarity. How do you see this?
Yeah, I think even in some respects, because of the divide, there is a desire for unity, a desire for solidarity. One of the problems we have in our politics is that our parties are deeply divided about how the country ought to be unified, and that's a challenging thing to be divided about. But I think that if you listen to each party, there is a strong desire to offer people ways of coming together, to offer people ways to be unified, so that in the language that comes out of today's Republican Party, and in some respects also from President Trump, the idea is that we ought to find ways to unify Americans by drawing clearer lines between ours and others, a concern for Americans first, for all that language certainly does have a dark past. It seems to me the way it's used today is really about making this a home for Americans in a way that allows Americans to be unified together. There are a lot of problems with how that's taken shape in the language of the administration and in the policies, but I think the desire is there. The desire for solidarity is there. Similarly, on the left, where I have also a lot of problems with how policy ideas are taking shape and with how language is used and has fallen into a kind of identity politics, I do think there is a desire there to find ways to unify Americans across lines. And that desire is what we can work with. I don't think that there's a lot constructive in contemporary identity politics, but the desire for solidarity can be a place to start for a politics that's more focused on where America ought to be.
Now, some people may hear us and think, okay, we're either going to unify around the goals of the left or
Right.
unify around the goals of the right. That's never going to happen.
Right.
Are there some real opportunities, do you think, to take some from one side, some from the other,
Yeah.
and maybe find something that does unify us?
I think the American answer to that question has always been start local. It is easier to find unity in your community than it is to find it at a national level. And ultimately, when we build national unity, we often build it, at least in peacetime, by building up from the bottom and not by building down from the top. And so it seems to me that this is a moment to decentralize power in American political life and to find ways to empower communities, to empower civic institutions, even to empower families to have more control over their lives in ways that might allow them to find their path toward unity, to rediscover what unifies them with their neighbors. And ultimately, that is a way to build up the path toward greater national unity, too.
That is the voice of Yuval Levin, editor of National Affairs, author most recently of The Fractured Republic. Given that we have seen people self-segregate in terms of where they live, is local really going to be the only answer for this? That you'll see some communities that are more unified that perhaps lean more left, some communities that are more unified that lean more to the right?
I think you will see some of that. There's no way around that when you turn your attention to localism. But the fact is, even left and right mean different things in different places. And it does seem to me that if we think of our parties as broader national coalitions that take into account regional differences as well as ideological differences, we'd be in a better place to find our path toward unity, or at least toward accommodation at the national level. And so I'm a big believer in federalism. I'm a big believer in subsidiarity, in allowing solutions to arise from the bottom up. That is ultimately just a better way to make it possible for people to work together, even when they disagree. The disagreements are not going to disappear, and so what we need are ways of living with them and ultimately of finding some commonality.
Do we have some opportunities also if we see more of these solutions coming from the local level, that people will get to see what their neighbors are up to and say, yeah, that works, or no, I was right, that doesn't work?
Exactly. No, I think that's right. When we've always thought in some degree of this of federalism as a kind of mode of experimentation, allowing states to learn from one another from both their successes and their mistakes. The same is true at the local level. And so, absolutely, try it out is often the only way to know if a new idea is a good idea. And so, better to try it out first at the local level and the state level than to impose upon the whole country an idea that ends up being a disaster.
Obviously, this is an interesting concept that we're talking about here. Are you hearing anyone who's in a position of power actually making these same types of arguments, or is this something that we need to inculcate within the political class?
Well, it's certainly something we need to inculcate. There are some people in our politics who are interested in localism and in federalism. They're mostly on the right. There are people like Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Utah, of course, has a long tradition of self-reliance and community-mindedness. There are some other members of Congress who you will hear talk like this now and then. Ben Sass, the senator from Nebraska. On the left, there's much less of an inclination to decentralize, although right now there are some people that I would call kind of foul-weather federalists on the left who, because President Trump is president and because Republicans control Congress, have suddenly discovered that it's possible to try different things in California than in North Carolina. But I think, although that is often cynical, I think we should make the most of it and try to use that as a teaching opportunity and call their bluff.
We've seen in the recent political past that it's been successful to be divisive. I mean, President Trump is case number one. How do you convince others within the political realm that this other idea of making locals have more power and trying to be more building up more solidarity is a good way to go?
Well, look, I think the force that works in our favor most in this regard is the simple fact that Americans are not happy with the status quo. And so while it can sometimes be effective to turn every political question into a fight to the death in Washington, it's not satisfying to voters. It's not satisfying to the American public in general. And so I do think there's an opportunity to offer alternatives in ways that could be politically advantageous as well as good for the country.
What would be a good first step toward this goal?
I think you would want to focus on an issue. And so it seems to me that welfare reform is a good place to start. It's a place where the problems to be solved are very different from place to place, and where the argument for localism makes sense as a practical matter as well as a human matter, as a spiritual matter. The problems to be solved run very deep. And so I think I would start by advancing an agenda of welfare reform that is rooted in an idea of federalism and decentralization.
Do you see a push toward doing that anytime soon?
Well, Paul Ryan wants to do that, but at this point it doesn't seem as though Donald Trump wants to do it, and so I wouldn't count on it happening, but talking about it is a good start.